at Imam Mohammad bin Saud University in Saudi Arabia. I'm here with my colleague, Norah Alqahtani, to present our paper, Federated Identity Management System, Limitation and Solution. Federated identity is considered a promising approach to facilitate secure resources sharing among collaborative participants in heterogeneous IT environment. Many advantages demonstrated by federated identity management, such as reduce the cost and provide convenience for the users. However, federated identity management has limitations that lead to a lead security and privacy risk, and that's the topic of our paper. Let's start with the background information. Human identity is a representation of an individual by several properties, which indicate that person, reflecting its uniqueness and distinguish that person from others. Digital identity is the representation of that identity in a digital system. In today's system, living and working in a network environment require digital identity for each individual. And we can manage identities by identity management system, which is a set of procedures, policies, and technology that help authoritative sources as well as individual entity to manage and use identity information. Identity management procedure include management of the identity lifecycle, management of identity information, and management of entity authentication as initial step of authorization. Federated identity management is when a multiple enterprise allow individuals to use the same identification information or login credential to obtain access to the service or networks of all the enterprise in the group. The federated identity model include four logical components: user and user agent, service provider, and identity provider. In federated identity management system, the user might have one or more local identities issued by the service provider, in addition to a single identity issued by the identity provider within a specific domain called circuit of trust. Federated identity has aspects that are similar to a single sign-on, and some believe they are the same service, but they are different at their core. There are two things that federated identity does that service single sign-on cannot do. Single sign-on allow user to access multiple systems, but only within the single organization, whereas federated identity management allow user to log into systems across various organizations. And federated identity management is more secure than single sign-on because single sign-on, in the single sign-on, the user credential are being provided to any system that that the user is logging into, while federated identity management, user credential are only given to the identity provider exclusively. Here we provide a comparison between federated identity management and single sign-on based on the single access and user credential, login to service several services, and use of the same credential, and the authentication process and identity federation. In the industry, there are several federation identity management architecture, such as Liberty Alliance, WS Federation, Shibboleth, OpenID, and OpenID Connect, which is the third generation of OpenID technology. In our paper, we provide a comparison between these architecture. The comparison made based on the identity mapping and the targeted area, storage of identity information, and if it supports single sign-on and single logout, and the security tokens used in each architecture, and the access to services. For the presentation's sake, I only choose 3 of them, but in our paper, the comparison is made on 6 different architectures. While federated identity in general is seen as a good thing, it does have some disadvantages. We determine this limitation based on how it affects the user. First is the trust. The interaction in federated identity management system occur only between pre-configured entities or a closed circuit of trust. Entity trust relationship must be pre-configured either during the registration phase to the system or via trust negotiation process offline. Such a limitation makes the system impractical and unscalable. Privacy and data protection are major concerns in federated identity system. There is no guarantee to prevent service provider and identity provider from misusing of identity information of user. Even though there are regulation and privacy policies that protect the privacy of users, there are no requirement to enforce these regulation and policies. And one of the major limitations in most of federated identity standards, such as Shabelah, Liberty, and OpenID, is that the identity provider discovery is provided on the service provider server. This limitation could be exploited by a malicious service provider to redirect the user to a website masquerading as the identity provider, which could then acquire the user security credential. Another limitation is that user can only choose one of their identity provider in any single working session with the service provider. This isn't sufficient, especially for web-based services. And complexity for the user is also a drawback in federated identity management, especially because of the need from the user to choose their identity provider at discovery services, and the user have to remember which federation they belong to, along with the username and password. On the user side, the management of the identity is getting more complicated if the user uses multiple federation. Revocation means disabling the identity data, so they can't be used for identification and authorization purpose anymore. Current federated identity management system lack practical and efficient revocation techniques. This may lead to a security violation. We move to the solution. Here we present the existing solution for the challenges and limitations that has been discussed. The dynamic establishment of a trust relationship between entity could solve the trust issue. And for preserving privacy and to protect user identity, pseudonyms, undetectability, unlinkability are an important techniques. Undetectability means user ability to conceal action from other parties, while unlinkability concern of hiding correlation between a combination of actions and identity, making it impossible to recognize two separate usage of the same credentials. And a common solution to the problem of identity provider discovery is to provide a list of identity provider to user to choose from. So the user must select the proper identity provider. And supporting attribute aggregation will help to solve the limitation which users is limited to choose one of their identity provider in any working session with a service provider. The Liberty Alliance was the first group to address the problem of attribute aggregation through the model of identity federation. And one solution to mitigate the privacy concerns and complexity of the user is to empower user to control their identities. Increasing user control over their information is a good solution to avoid the misuse of information and data leakage. And regarding identity management, techniques to protect message confidentiality and integrity are essential to prevent compromisation of sensitive identity attributes or modification of identity attributes. Message security is essential in federated identity management to prevent attackers from manipulating the message that are in transit. The distribution of user identity information among various entity and use techniques such as encryption, zero knowledge proof, will prevent identity theft within identity provider or service provider. And lastly, a common way to mitigate revocation challenge is to limit the security token lifetime. So in our paper, we discussed the concept of personal identity and a real world in digital identity, and the notion of and the model of identity federation. And we present a comprehensive comparison between different federated identity architectures and the limitation of federated identity management based on how it affects the user, and the solution that proposed to mitigate the risk of this solution. With that, we end our presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any question, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much for the presentation.